Don't forget to subscribe. Afterwards, the wisest and most spiritual books from the greatest authors await you every day. And now buckle up, sit back and we'll begin. Carlos Castaneda. Book 3. The Journey to Ixtlan. Not doing. Wednesday, April 11, 1962. Upon returning to his house, Don Juan recommended that I work on my notes as if nothing had happened to me, and not to mention or even be concerned with any of the events I had experienced. After a day's rest, he announced that we had to leave the area for a few days because it was advisable to put distance between us and those entities. He said that they had affected me deeply, although I was not noticing their effect yet, because my body was not sensitive enough. In a short while, however, I would fall seriously ill if I did not go to my place of predilection to be cleansed and restored. We left before dawn and drove north, and after an exhausting drive and a fast hike, we arrived at the hilltop in the late afternoon. Don Juan, as he had done before, covered the spot where I had once slept with small branches and leaves. Then he gave me a handful of leaves to put against the skin of my abdomen and told me to lie down and rest. He fixed another place for himself slightly to my left, about 5 feet away from my head, and also lay down. In a matter of minutes I began to feel an exquisite warmth and a sense of supreme well-being. It was a sense of physical comfort, a sensation of being suspended in midair. I could fully agree with Don Juan's statement that the bed of strings would keep me floating. I commented on the unbelievable quality of my sensory experience. Don Juan said in a factual tone that the bed was made for that purpose. "I can't believe that this is possible," I exclaimed. Don Juan took my statement literally and scolded me. He said he was tired of my acting as an ultimately important being that has to be given proof over and over that the world is unknown and marvelous. I tried to explain that a rhetorical exclamation had no significance. He retorted that if that were so I could have chosen another statement. It seemed that he was seriously annoyed with me. I sat up halfway and began to apologize, but he laughed and, imitating my manner of speaking, suggested a series of hilarious rhetorical exclamations I could have used instead. I ended up laughing at the calculated absurdity of some of his proposed alternatives. He giggled and in a soft tone reminded me that I should abandon myself to the sensation of floating. The soothing feeling of peace and plenitude that I experienced in that mysterious place aroused some deeply buried emotions in me. I began to talk about my life. I confessed that I had never respected or liked anybody, not even myself, and that I had always felt I was inherently evil, and thus my attitude towards others was always veiled with a certain bravado and daring. "True," Don Juan said. "You don't like yourself at all." He cackled and told me that he had been seeing while I talked. His recommendation was that I should not have remorse for anything I had done, because to isolate one's acts as being mean, or ugly, or evil was to place an unwarranted importance on the self. I moved nervously, and the bed of leaves made a rustling sound. Don Juan said that if I wanted to rest I should not make my leaves feel agitated, and that I should imitate him and lie without making a single movement. He added that in his seeing he had come across one of my moods. He struggled for a moment, seemingly to find a proper word, and said that the mood in question was a frame of mind I continually lapsed into. He described it as a sort of trap door that opened at unexpected times and swallowed me. I asked him to be more specific. He replied that it was impossible to be specific about seeing. Before I could say anything else, he told me I should relax, but not fall asleep, and be in a state of awareness for as long as I could. He said that the bed of strings was made exclusively to allow a warrior to arrive at a certain state of peace and well-being. In a dramatic tone, Don Juan stated that well-being was a condition one had to groom, a condition one had to become acquainted with in order to seek it. You don't know what well-being is because you have never experienced it, he said. I disagreed with him. But he continued arguing that well-being was an achievement one had to deliberately seek. He said that the only thing I knew how to seek was a sense of disorientation, ill-being, and confusion. He laughed mockingly and assured me that in order to accomplish the feat of making myself miserable, I had to work in a most intense fashion, and that it was absurd. I had never realized I could work just the same in making myself complete and strong. The trick is in what one emphasizes, he said. We either make ourselves miserable, or we make ourselves strong. The amount of work is the same. I closed my eyes and relaxed again, and began to feel I was floating. For a short while it was as if I were actually moving through space, like a leaf. Although it was utterly pleasurable, the feeling somehow reminded me of times when I had become sick and dizzy, and would experience a sensation of spinning. I thought perhaps I had eaten something bad. I heard Don Juan talking to me, but I did not really make an effort to listen. I was trying to make a mental inventory of all the things I had eaten that day, but I could not become interested in it. It did not seem to matter. Watch the way the sunlight changes, he said. His voice was clear. I thought it was like water, fluid and warm. The sky was totally free of clouds towards the west, and the sunlight was spectacular. Perhaps the fact that Don Juan was cueing me made the yellowish glow of the afternoon sun truly magnificent. Let that glow kindle you, Don Juan said. Before the sun goes down today you must be perfectly calm and restored, because tomorrow or the day after, you are going to learn not doing. Learn not doing what? I asked. Never mind now, he said. Wait until we are in those lava mountains. He pointed to some distant jagged, dark, menacing-looking peaks towards the north. Thursday, April 12, 1962, we reached the high desert around the lava mountains in the late afternoon. In the distance the dark brown lava mountains looked almost sinister. The sun was very low on the horizon and shone on the western face of the solidified lava, tinting its dark brownness with a dazzling array of yellow reflections. I could not keep my eyes away. Those peaks were truly mesmerizing. By the end of the day the bottom slopes of the mountains were in sight. There was very little vegetation on the high desert. All I could see were cacti and a kind of tall grass that grew in tufts. Don Juan stopped to rest. He sat down, carefully propped his food gourds against a rock, and said that we were going to camp on that spot for the night. He had picked a relatively high place. From where I stood I could see quite a distance away, all around us. It was a cloudy day, and the twilight quickly enveloped the area. I became involved in watching the speed with which the crimson clouds on the west faded into a uniform thick dark gray. Don Juan got up and went to the bushes. By the time he came back the silhouette of the lava mountains was a dark mass. He sat down next to me and called my attention to what seemed to be a natural formation on the mountains towards the northeast. It was a spot which had a color much lighter than its surroundings. While the whole range of lava mountains looked uniformly dark brown in the twilight, the spot he was pointing at was actually yellowish or dark beige. I could not figure out what it could be. I stared at it for a long time. It seemed to be moving. I fancied it to be pulsating. When I squinted my eyes, it actually rippled as if the wind were moving it. "Look at it fixedly," Don Juan commanded me. At one moment, after I had maintained my stare for quite a while, I felt that the whole range of mountains was moving towards me. That feeling was accompanied by an unusual agitation in the pit of my stomach. The discomfort became so acute that I stood up. "Sit down," Don Juan yelled, but I was already on my feet. From my new point of view, the yellowish formation was lower on the side of the mountains. I sat down again, without taking my eyes away, and the formation shifted to a higher place. I stared at it for an instant, and suddenly I arranged everything into the correct perspective. I realized that what I had been looking at was not in the mountains at all, but was really a piece of yellowish-green cloth hanging from a tall cactus in front of me. I laughed out loud and explained to Don Juan that the twilight had helped to create an optical illusion. He got up and walked to the place where the piece of cloth was hanging, took it down, folded it, and put it inside his pouch. "What are you doing that for?" I asked. "Because this piece of cloth has power," he said casually. "For a moment you were doing fine with it, and there is no way of knowing what may have happened if you had remained seated." Friday, April 75, 1962. At the crack of dawn we headed for the mountains. They were surprisingly far away. By midday we walked into one of the canyons. There was some water in shallow pools. We sat to rest in the shade of a hanging cliff. The mountains were clumps of a monumental lava flow. The solidified lava had weathered over the millennia into a porous dark brown rock. Only a few sturdy weeds grew between the rocks and in the cracks. Looking up at the almost perpendicular walls of the canyon, I had a weird sensation in the pit of my stomach. The walls were hundreds of feet high and gave me the feeling that they were closing in on me. The sun was almost overhead, slightly towards the southwest. "Stand up here," Don Juan said, and maneuvered my body until I was looking towards the sun. He told me to look fixedly at the mountain walls above me. The sight was stupendous. The magnificent height of the lava flow staggered my imagination. I began to wonder what a volcanic upheaval it must have been. I looked up and down the sides of the canyon various times. I became immersed in the richness of color in the rock wall. There were specks of every conceivable hue. There were patches of light gray moss or lichen in every rock. I looked right above my head and noticed that the sunlight was producing the most exquisite reflections when it hit the brilliant specks of the solidified lava. I stared at an area in the mountains where the sunlight was being reflected. As the sun moved, the intensity diminished, then it faded completely. I looked across the canyon and saw another area of the same exquisite light refractions. I told Don Juan what was happening, and then I spotted another area of light, and then another in a different place, and another, until the whole canyon was blotched with big patches of light. I felt dizzy. Even if I closed my eyes, I could still see the brilliant lights. I held my head in my hands and tried to crawl under the hanging cliff, but Don Juan grabbed my arm firmly and imperatively told me to look at the walls of the mountains and try to figure out spots of heavy darkness in the midst of the fields of light. I did not want to look, because the glare bothered my eyes. I said that what was happening to me was similar to staring into a sunny street through a window, and then seeing the window frame as a dark silhouette everywhere else. Don Juan shook his head from side to side and began to chuckle. He let go of my arm and we sat down again under the hanging cliff. I was jotting down my impressions of the surroundings when Don Juan, after a long silence, suddenly spoke in a dramatic tone. "I have brought you here to teach you one thing," he said and paused. "You are going to learn not doing. We might as well talk about it because there is no other way for you to proceed. I thought you might catch on to not doing without my having to say anything. I was wrong. I don't know what you're talking about, Don Juan." "It doesn't matter," he said. "I am going to tell you about something that is very simple but very difficult to perform. I am going to talk to you about not doing, in spite of the fact that there is no way to talk about it, because it is the body that does it." He stared at me in glances and then said that I had to pay the utmost attention to what he was going to say. I closed my notebook, but to my amazement he insisted that I should keep on writing. "Not doing is so difficult and so powerful that you should not mention it," he went on. "Not until you have stopped the world, only then can you talk about it freely, if that's what you'd want to do." Don Juan looked around and then pointed to a large rock. "That rock over there is a rock because of doing," he said. We looked at each other and he smiled. I waited for an explanation, but he remained silent. Finally, I had to say that I had not understood what he meant. "That's doing?" he exclaimed. "Pardon me? That's also doing. What are you talking about, Don Juan? Doing is what makes that rock a rock and that bush a bush. Doing is what makes you yourself and me myself." I told him that his explanation did not explain anything. He laughed and scratched his temples. "That's the problem with talking," he said. "It always makes one confuse the issues. If one starts talking about doing, one always ends up talking about something else. It is better to just act. Take that rock for instance. To look at it is doing, but to see it is not doing." I had to confess that his words were not making sense to me. "Oh yes, they do," he exclaimed. "But you are convinced that they don't because that is your doing. That is the way you act towards me in the world." He again pointed to the rock. "That rock is a rock because of all the things you know how to do to it," he said. "I call that doing. A man of knowledge, for instance, knows that the rock is a rock only because of doing, so if he doesn't want the rock to be a rock, all he has to do is not doing. See what I mean?" I did not understand him at all. He laughed and made another attempt at explaining. "The world is the world because you know the doing involved in making it so," he said. "If you didn't know it's doing, the world would be different." He examined me with curiosity. I stopped writing. I just wanted to listen to him. He went on explaining that without that certain doing there would be nothing familiar in the surroundings. He leaned over and picked up a small rock between the thumb and index of his left hand and held it in front of my eyes. "This is a pebble because you know the doing involved in making it into a pebble," he said. "What are you saying?" I asked with a feeling of bona fide confusion. Don Juan smiled. He seemed to be trying to hide a mischievous delight. "I don't know why you are so confused," he said. "Words are your predilection. You should be in heaven." He gave me a mysterious look and raised his brows 2 or 3 times. Then he pointed again to the small rock he was holding in front of my eyes. "I say that you are making this into a pebble because you know the doing involved in it," he said. "Now, in order to stop the world you must stop doing." He seemed to know that I still had not understood and smiled, shaking his head. He then took a twig and pointed to the uneven edge of the pebble. "In the case of this little rock," he went on, "the first thing which doing does to it is to shrink it to this size. So the proper thing to do, which a warrior does if he wants to stop the world, is to enlarge a little rock, or any other thing, by not doing." He stood up and placed the pebble on a boulder, and then asked me to come closer and examine it. He told me to look at the holes and depressions in the pebble, and try to pick out the minute detail in them. He said that if I could pick out the detail, the holes and depressions would disappear, and I would understand what not doing meant. "This damn pebble is going to drive you crazy today," he said. I must have had a look of bewilderment on my face. He looked at me and laughed uproariously. Then he pretended to get angry with the pebble and hit it 2 or 3 times with his hat. I urged him to clarify his point. I argued that it was possible for him to explain anything he wanted to if he made an effort. He gave me a sly glance and shook his head as if the situation were hopeless. "Sure, I can explain anything," he said, laughing. "But could you understand it?" I was taken aback by his insinuation. "Doing makes you separate the pebble from the larger boulder," he continued. "If you want to learn not doing, let's say that you have to join them." He pointed to the small shadow that the pebble cast on the boulder, and said that it was not a shadow but a glue which bound them together. He then turned around and walked away, saying that he was coming back to check on me later. I stared at the pebble for a long time. I could not focus my attention on the minute detail in the holes and depressions, but the tiny shadow that the pebble cast on the boulder became a most interesting point. Don Juan was right, it was like a glue. It moved and shifted. I had the impression it was being squeezed from underneath the pebble. When Don Juan returned, I related to him what I had observed about the shadow. "That's a good beginning," he said. "A warrior can tell all kinds of things from the shadows." He then suggested that I should take the pebble and bury it somewhere. "Why?" I asked. "You've been watching it for a long time," he said. "It has something of you now. A warrior always tries to affect the force of doing by changing it into not doing. Doing would be to leave the pebble lying around because it is merely a small rock. Not doing would be to proceed with that pebble as if it were something far beyond a mere rock. In this case, that pebble has soaked in you for a long time, and now it is you, and as such, you cannot leave it lying around, but must bury it. If you would have personal power, however, not doing would be to change that pebble into a power object. Can I do that now? Your life is not tight enough to do that. If you would see, you would know that your heavy concern has changed that pebble into something quite unappealing. Therefore, the best thing you can do is to dig a hole and bury it, and let the earth absorb its heaviness." Is all this true, Don Juan? To say yes or no to your question is doing. But since you are learning not doing, I have to tell you that it really doesn't matter whether or not all this is true. It is here that a warrior has a point of advantage over the average man. An average man cares that things are either true or false, but a warrior doesn't. An average man proceeds in a specific way with things that he knows are true, and in a different way with things that he knows are not true. If things are said to be true, he acts and believes in what he does. But if things are said to be untrue, he doesn't care to act, or he doesn't believe in what he does. A warrior, on the other hand, acts in both instances. If things are said to be true, he would act in order to do doing. If things are said to be untrue, he still would act in order to do not doing. See what I mean? No, I don't see what you mean at all, I said. Don Juan's statements put me in a belligerent mood. I could not make sense of what he was saying. I told him it was gibberish, and he mocked me and said that I did not even have an impeccable spirit in what I like to do the most, talking. He actually made fun of my verbal command and found it faulty and inadequate. If you are going to be all mouth, be a mouth warrior, he said and roared with laughter. I felt dejected. My ears were buzzing. I experienced an uncomfortable heat in my head. I was actually embarrassed and presumably red in the face. I stood up and went into the chaparral and buried the pebble. I was teasing you a little bit, Don Juan said when I returned and sat down again. And yet I know that if you don't talk, you don't understand. Talking is doing for you, but talking is not appropriate, and if you want to know what I mean by not doing, you have to do a simple exercise. Since we are concerned with not doing, it doesn't matter whether you do the exercise now or 10 years from now. He made me lie down and took my right arm and bent it at my elbow. Then he turned my hand until the palm was facing the front. He curved my fingers so my hand looked as if I were holding a doorknob, and then he began to move my arm back and forth with a circular motion that resembled the act of pushing and pulling a lever attached to a wheel. Don Juan said that a warrior executed that movement every time he wanted to push something out of his body, something like a disease or an unwelcome feeling. The idea was to push and pull an imaginary opposing force until one felt a heavy object, a solid body, stopping the free movements of the hand. In the case of the exercise, not doing consisted in repeating it until one felt a heavy body with the hand, in spite of the fact that one could never believe it was possible to feel it. I began moving my arm, and in a short while my hand became ice cold. I had begun to feel a sort of mushiness around my hand. It was as if I were paddling through some heavy viscous liquid matter. Don Juan made a sudden movement and grabbed my arm to stop the motion. My whole body shivered as though stirred by some unseen force. He scrutinized me as I sat up, and then walked around me before he sat back down on the place where he had been. "You've done enough," he said. "You may do this exercise some other time, when you have more personal power." Did I do something wrong? No. Not doing is only for very strong warriors, and you don't have the power to deal with it yet. Now you will only trap horrendous things with your hand. So do it little by little, until your hand doesn't get cold anymore. Whenever your hand remains warm, you can actually feel the lines of the world with it. He paused as if to give me time to ask about the lines. But before I had a chance to, he started explaining that there were infinite numbers of lines that joined us to things. He said that the exercise of not doing that he had just described would help anyone to feel a line that came out from the moving hand, a line that one could place or cast wherever one wanted to. Don Juan said that this was only an exercise because the lines formed by the hand were not durable enough to be of real value in a practical situation. A man of knowledge uses other parts of his body to produce durable lines, he said. What parts of the body, Don Juan? The most durable lines that a man of knowledge produces come from the middle of the body, he said. But he can also make them with his eyes. Are they real lines? Surely. Can you see them and touch them? Let's say that you can feel them. The most difficult part about the warrior's way is to realize that the world is a feeling. When one is not doing, one is feeling the world, and one feels the world through its lines. He paused and examined me with curiosity. He raised his brows and opened his eyes and then blinked. The effect was like the eyes of a bird blinking. Almost immediately I felt a sensation of discomfort and queasiness. It was actually as if something was applying pressure to my stomach. See what I mean? Don Juan asked and moved his eyes away. I mentioned that I felt nauseated and he replied in a matter-of-fact tone that he knew it and that he was trying to make me feel the lines of the world with his eyes. I could not accept the claim that he himself was making me feel that way. I voiced my doubts. I could hardly conceive the idea that he was causing my feeling of nausea, since he had not, in any physical way, impinged on me. Not doing is very simple but very difficult, he said. It is not a matter of understanding it, but of mastering it. Seeing, of course, is the final accomplishment of a man of knowledge. And seeing is attained only when one has stopped the world through the technique of not doing. I smiled involuntarily. I had not understood what he meant. When one does something with people, he said, the concern should be only with presenting the case to their bodies. That's what I've been doing with you so far, letting your body know. Who cares whether or not you understand? But that's unfair, Don Juan. I want to understand everything, otherwise coming here would be a waste of my time. A waste of your time? He exclaimed, parodying my tone of voice. You certainly are conceited. He stood up and told me that we were going to hike to the top of the lava peak to our right. The ascent to the top was an excruciating affair. It was actual mountain climbing, except that there were no ropes to aid and protect us. Don Juan repeatedly told me not to look down, and he had to actually pull me up bodily a couple of times after I had begun to slide down the rock. I felt terribly embarrassed that Don Juan, being so old, had to help me. I told him that I was in poor physical condition because I was too lazy to do any exercise. He replied that once one had arrived at a certain level of personal power, exercise or any training of that sort was unnecessary, since all one needed, to be in an impeccable form, was to engage oneself and not doing. When we arrived at the top, I lay down. I was about to be sick. He rolled me back and forth with his foot as he had done once before. Little by little the motion restored my balance. But I felt nervous. It was as if I were somehow waiting for the sudden appearance of something. I involuntarily looked 2 or 3 times to each side. Don Juan did not say a word, but he also looked in the direction I was looking. Shadows are peculiar affairs, he said all of a sudden. You must have noticed that there is one following us. I haven't noticed anything of the sort, I protested in a loud voice. Don Juan said that my body had noticed our pursuer, in spite of my stubborn opposition, and assured me in a confident tone that there was nothing unusual about being followed by a shadow. It is just a power, he said. These mountains are filled with them. It is just like one of those entities that scared you the other night. I wanted to know if I could actually perceive it myself. He asserted that in the daytime I could only feel its presence. I wanted an explanation of why he called it a shadow when obviously it was not like the shadow of a boulder. He replied that both had the same lines, therefore both were shadows. He pointed to a long boulder standing directly in front of us. "Look at the shadow of that boulder," he said. "The shadow is the boulder, and yet it isn't. To observe the boulder in order to know what the boulder is doing, but to observe its shadow is not doing. Shadows are like doors, the doors of not doing. A man of knowledge, for example, can tell the innermost feelings of men by watching their shadows. Is there movement in them?" I asked. "You may say that there is movement in them, or you may say that the lines of the world are shown in them, or you may say that feelings come from them. But how could feelings come out of shadows, Don Juan? To believe that shadows are just shadows is doing," he explained. "That belief is somehow stupid. Think about it this way. There is so much more to everything in the world that obviously there must be more to shadows too. After all, what makes them shadows is merely our doing." There was a long silence. I did not know what else to say. "The end of the day is approaching," Don Juan said, looking at the sky. "You have to use this brilliant sunlight to perform one last exercise." He led me to a place where there were two peaks the size of a man standing parallel to each other, about 4 or 5 feet apart. Don Juan stopped 10 yards away from them, facing the west. He marked a spot for me to stand on and told me to look at the shadows of the peaks. He said that I should watch them and cross my eyes in the same manner I ordinarily cross them when scanning the ground for a place to rest. He clarified his directions by saying that when searching for a resting place, one had to look without focusing, but in observing shadows, one had to cross the eyes and yet keep a sharp image in focus. The idea was to let one shadow be superimposed on the other by crossing the eyes. He explained that through that process one could ascertain a certain feeling which emanated from shadows. I commented on his vagueness, but he maintained that there was really no way of describing what he meant. My attempt to carry out the exercise was futile. I struggled until I got a headache. Don Juan was not at all concerned with my failure. He climbed to a dome-like peak and yelled from the top, telling me to look for 2 small long and narrow pieces of rock. He showed with his hands the size rock he wanted. I found 2 pieces and handed them to him. Don Juan placed each rock about a foot apart in 2 crevices, made me stand above them facing the west, and told me to do the same exercise with their shadows. This time it was an altogether different affair. Almost immediately I was capable of crossing my eyes and perceiving their individual shadows, as if they had merged into one. I noticed that the act of looking without converging the images gave the single shadow I had formed an unbelievable depth and a sort of transparency. I stared at it, bewildered. Every hole in the rock, on the area where my eyes were focused, was neatly discernible, and the composite shadow, which was superimposed on them, was like a film of indescribable transparency. I did not want to blink, for fear of losing the image I was so precariously holding. Finally my sore eyes forced me to blink, but I did not lose the view of the detail at all. In fact, by remoistening my cornea the image became even clearer. I noticed at that point that it was as if I were looking from an immeasurable height at a world I had never seen before. I also noticed that I could scan the surroundings of the shadow without losing the focus of my visual perception. Then, for an instant, I lost the notion that I was looking at a rock. I felt that I was landing in a world vast beyond anything I had ever conceived. This extraordinary perception lasted for a second, and then everything was turned off. I automatically looked up and saw Don Juan standing directly above the rocks, facing me. He had blocked the sunlight with his body. I described the unusual sensation I had had, and he explained that he had been forced to interrupt it because he saw that I was about to get lost in it. He added that it was a natural tendency for all of us to indulge ourselves when feelings of that nature occur, and that by indulging myself in it, I had almost turned not doing into my old familiar doing. He said that what I should have done was to maintain the view without succumbing to it, because in a way doing was a manner of succumbing. I complained that he should have told me beforehand what to expect and what to do, but he pointed out that he had no way of knowing whether or not I would succeed in merging the shadows. I had to confess I was more mystified than ever about not doing. Don Juan's comments were that I should be satisfied with what I had done, because for once I had proceeded correctly, that by reducing the world I had enlarged it, and that, although I had been far from feeling the lines of the world, I had correctly used the shadow of the rocks as a door into not doing. The statement that I had enlarged the world by reducing it intrigued me to no end. The detail of the porous rock, in the small area where my eyes were focused, was so vivid and so precisely defined that the top of the round peak became a vast world for me, and yet it was really a reduced vision of the rock. When Don Juan blocked the light and I found myself looking as I normally would do, the precise detail became dull. The tiny holes in the porous rock became bigger, the brown color of the dried lava became opaque, and everything lost the shiny transparency that made the rock into a real world. Don Juan then took the two rocks, laid them gently into a deep crevice, and sat down cross-legged facing the west, on the spot where the rocks had been. He patted a spot next to him to his left and told me to sit down. We did not speak for a long time. Then we ate, also in silence. It was only after the sun had set that he suddenly turned and asked me about my progress in dreaming. I told him that it had been easy in the beginning, but that at the moment I had ceased altogether to find my hands in my dreams. When you first started dreaming you were using my personal power, that's why it was easier, he said. Now you are empty. But you must keep on trying until you have enough power of your own. You see, dreaming is the not doing of dreams, and as you progress in your not doing you will also progress in dreaming. The trick is not to stop looking for your hands, even if you don't believe that what you are doing has any meaning. In fact, as I have told you before, a warrior doesn't need to believe, because as long as he keeps on acting without believing he is not doing. We looked at each other for a moment. There is nothing else I can tell you about dreaming, he continued. Everything I may say would only be not doing. But if you tackle not doing directly, you yourself would know what to do in dreaming. To find your hands is essential, though, at this time, and I am sure you will. I don't know, Don Juan. I don't trust myself. This is not a matter of trusting anybody. This whole affair is a matter of a warrior's struggle, and you will keep on struggling, if not under your own power, then perhaps under the impact of a worthy opponent, or with the help of some allies. Like the one which is already following you. I made a jerky involuntary movement with my right arm. Don Juan said that my body knew much more than I suspected, because the force that had been pursuing us was to my right. He confided in a low tone of voice that twice that day the ally had come so close to me that he had had to step in and stop it. During the day, shadows are the doors of not doing, he said. But at night, since very little doing prevails in the dark, everything is a shadow, including the allies. I've already told you about this when I taught you the gate of power. I laughed out loud and my own laughter scared me. Everything I have taught you so far has been an aspect of not doing, he went on. A warrior applies not doing to everything in the world, and yet I can't tell you more about it than what I have said today. You must let your own body discover the power and the feeling of not doing. I had another fit of nervous cackling. It is stupid for you to scorn the mysteries of the world simply because you know the doing of scorn, he said with a serious face. I assured him that I was not scorning anything or anyone, but that I was more nervous and incompetent than he thought. I've always been that way, I said. And yet I want to change, but I don't know how. I am so inadequate. I already know that you think you are rotten, he said. That's your doing. Now, in order to effect that doing, I am going to recommend that you learn another doing. From now on, and for a period of 8 days, I want you to lie to yourself. Instead of telling yourself the truth, that you are ugly and rotten and inadequate, you will tell yourself that you are the complete opposite, knowing that you are lying, and that you are absolutely beyond hope. But what would be the point of lying like that, Don Juan? It may hook you to another doing, and then you may realize that both doings are lies, unreal, and that to hinge yourself to either one is a waste of time, because the only thing that is real is the being in you that is going to die. To arrive at that being is the not doing of the self. The Ring of Power. Saturday, April 14, 1962. Don Juan felt the weight of our gourds and concluded that we had exhausted our food supply and that it was time to return home. I casually mentioned that it was going to take us at least a couple of days to get to his house. He said he was not going back to Sonora, but to a border town where he had some business to take care of. I thought we were going to start our descent through a water canyon, but Don Juan headed towards the northwest on the high plateaus of the lava mountains. After about an hour of walking, he led me into a deep ravine, which ended at a point where two peaks almost joined. There was a slope there, going almost to the top of the range, a strange slope which looked like a slanted concave bridge between the two peaks. Don Juan pointed to an area on the face of the slope. Look there fixedly, he said. The sun is almost right. He explained that at midday the light of the sun could help me with not doing. He then gave me a series of commands. To loosen all the tight garments I had on, to sit in a cross-legged position, and to look intently at the spot he had specified. There were very few clouds in the sky and none towards the west. It was a hot day and the sunlight beamed on the solidified lava. I kept a very close watch over the area in question. After a long vigil, I asked what, specifically, I was supposed to look for. He made me be quiet with an impatient gesture of his hand. I was tired. I wanted to go to sleep. I half closed my eyes. They were itching and I rubbed them, but my hands were clammy, and the sweat made my eyes sting. I looked at the lava peaks through half-closed eyelids, and suddenly the whole mountain was lit up. I told Don Juan that if I squinted my eyes I could see the whole range of mountains as an intricate array of light fibers. He told me to breathe as little as possible in order to maintain the view of the light fibers, and not to stare intently into it, but to look casually at a point on the horizon right above the slope. I followed his instructions and was able to hold the view of an interminable extension covered with a web of light. Don Juan said in a very soft voice that I should try to isolate areas of darkness within the field of light fibers, and that right after finding a dark spot, I should open my eyes and check where that spot was on the face of the slope. I was incapable of perceiving any dark areas. I squinted my eyes and then opened them up various times. Don Juan drew closer to me and pointed to an area to my right, and then to some other one right in front of me. I tried to change the position of my body. I thought that perhaps if I shifted my perspective, I would be able to perceive the supposed area of darkness he was pointing to. But Don Juan shook my arm and told me in a severe tone to keep still and be patient. I again squinted my eyes and once more saw the web of light fibers. I looked at it for a moment, and then I opened my eyes wider. At that instant I heard a faint rumble. It could have easily been explained as the distant sound of a jet plane, and then, with my eyes wide open, I saw the whole range of mountains in front of me as an enormous field of tiny dots of light. It was as if for a brief moment some metallic specks in the solidified lava were reflecting the sunlight in unison. Then the sunlight grew dim and was suddenly turned off, and the mountains became a mass of dull dark brown rock, and at the same time it also became windy and cold. I wanted to turn around to see if the sun had disappeared behind a cloud, but Don Juan held my head and did not let me move. He said that if I turned I might catch a glimpse of an entity of the mountains, the ally that was following us. He assured me that I did not have the necessary strength to stand aside of that nature, and then he added in a calculated tone that the rumble I had heard was the peculiar way in which an ally heralded its presence. He then stood up and announced that we were going to start climbing up the side of the slope. "Where are we going?" I asked. He pointed to one of the areas he had isolated as being a spot of darkness. He explained that not doing had allowed him to single out that spot as a possible center of power, or perhaps as a place where power objects might be found. We reached the spot he had in mind after a painful climb. He stood motionless for a moment a few feet in front of me. I tried to come closer to him, but he signaled me with his hand to stop. He seemed to be orienting himself. I could see the back of his head moving as if he were sweeping his eyes up and down the mountain. Then with sure steps he led the way to a ledge. He sat down and began to wipe some loose dirt off the ledge with his hand. He dug with his fingers around a small piece of rock that was sticking out, cleaning the dirt around it. Then he ordered me to dig it out. Once I had dislodged the piece of rock, he told me to immediately put it inside my shirt, because it was a power object that belonged to me. He said that he was giving it to me to keep, and that I should polish and care for it. Right after that we began our descent into a water canyon, and a couple of hours later we were in the high desert at the foot of the lava mountains. Don Juan walked about 10 feet ahead of me and kept up a very good pace. We went south until just before sunset. A heavy bank of clouds in the west prevented us from seeing the sun, but we paused until it had presumably disappeared over the horizon. Don Juan changed directions then and headed towards the southeast. We went over a hill, and as we got to the top I spotted 4 men coming towards us from the south. I looked at Don Juan. We had never encountered people in our excursions, and I did not know what to do in a case like that. But he did not seem to be concerned. He kept on walking as if nothing had happened. The men moved as if they were not in a hurry. They meandered towards where we were in a leisurely way. When they were closer to us, I noticed that they were 4 young Indians. They seemed to recognize Don Juan. He talked to them in Spanish. They were very soft-spoken and treated him with great deference. Only one of them spoke to me. I asked Don Juan in a whisper if I could also talk to them, and he nodded his head affirmatively. Once I engaged them in conversation, they were very friendly and communicative, especially the one who had first spoken to me. They told me they were there in search of power quartz crystals. They said that they had been wandering around the lava mountains for several days, but they had not had any luck. Don Juan looked around and pointed to a rocky area about 200 yards away. "That's a good place to camp for a while," he said. He began to walk towards the rocks and we all followed him. The area he had selected was very rugged. There were no bushes on it. We sat down on the rocks. Don Juan announced that he was going to go back into the chaparral to gather dry branches for a fire. I wanted to help him, but he whispered to me that this was a special fire for those brave young men, and he did not need my help. The young men sat down around me in a close cluster. One of them sat with his back against mine. I felt a bit embarrassed. When Don Juan returned with a pile of sticks, he commended them for their carefulness and told me that the young men were a sorcerer's apprentices and that it was the rule to make a circle and have 2 people back to back in the center when going on hunting parties for power objects. One of the young men asked me if I had ever found any crystals myself. I told him that Don Juan had never taken me to look for them. Don Juan selected a place close to a big boulder and started to make a fire. None of the young men moved to help him, but watched him attentively. When all the sticks were burning, Don Juan sat with his back against a boulder. The fire was to his right. The young men apparently knew what was going on, but I did not have the faintest idea about the procedure to follow when one was dealing with sorcerer's apprentices. I watched the young men. They sat facing Don Juan, making a perfect half circle. I noticed then that Don Juan was directly facing me, and 2 of the young men had sat to my left and the other 2 to my right. Don Juan began telling them that I was in the lava mountains to learn not doing, and that an ally had been following us. I thought that that was a very dramatic beginning, and I was right. The young men changed positions and sat with their left legs tucked under their seats. I had not observed how they were sitting before. I had assumed that they were sitting the same way I was, cross-legged. A casual glance at Don Juan revealed to me that he was also sitting with his left leg tucked in. He made a barely perceptible gesture with his chin to point at my sitting position. I casually tucked in my left leg. Don Juan had once told me that that was the posture that a sorcerer used when things were uncertain. It had always proved, however, to be a very tiring position for me. I felt it was going to be a terrible imposition on me to remain seated in that fashion for the duration of his talk. Don Juan seemed to be thoroughly aware of my handicap, and in a succinct manner explained to the young men that quartz crystals could be found in certain specific spots in that area, and that once they were found they had to be coaxed to leave their abode by means of special techniques. The crystals then became the man himself, and their power went beyond our understanding. He said that ordinarily quartz crystals were found in clusters, and that it was up to the man who had found them to choose 5 of the longest and best-looking blades of quartz and sever them from their matrix. The finder was responsible for carving and polishing them in order to make them pointed and to make them fit perfectly to the size and shape of the fingers of his right hand. Then he told us that the quartz crystals were weapons used for sorcery, that they were usually hurled to kill, and that they penetrated the enemy's body and then returned to their owner's hand as though they had never left it. Next, he talked about the search for the spirit that would turn the ordinary crystals into weapons, and said that the first thing one had to do was to find a propitious place to lure out the spirit. That place had to be on a hilltop and was found by sweeping the hand, with the palm turned towards the earth, until a certain heat was detected with the palm of the hand. A fire had to be made on that spot. Don Juan explained that the ally was attracted by the flames and manifested itself through a series of consistent noises. The person searching for an ally had to follow the direction of the noises until the ally revealed itself, and then wrestle it to the ground in order to overpower it. It was at that point that one could make the ally touch the crystals to imbue them with power. He warned us that there were other forces at large in those lava mountains, forces which did not resemble the allies. They did not make any noise, but appeared only as fleeting shadows, and did not have any power at all. Don Juan added that a brilliantly colored feather or some highly polished quartz crystals would attract the attention of an ally, but in the long run any object whatever would be equally effective, because the important part was not to find the objects, but to find the force that would imbue them with power. What's the use of having beautifully polished crystals if you never find the spirit giver of power? He said. On the other hand, if you don't have the crystals but do find the spirit, you may put anything in his way to be touched. You could put your dicks in the way if you can't find anything else. The young men giggled. The most daring of them, the one who talked to me first, laughed loudly. I noticed that Don Juan had crossed his legs and was sitting in a relaxed manner. All the young men had also crossed their legs. I tried to slip casually into a more relaxed posture, but my left knee seemed to have a pinched nerve or a sore muscle, and I had to stand up and jog on the spot for a few minutes. Don Juan made a joking comment. He said I was out of practice kneeling down, because I had not been to confession in years, ever since I had begun running around with him. That produced a great commotion among the young men. They laughed in spurts. Some of them covered their faces and giggled nervously. I'm going to show you fellows something, Don Juan said casually after the young men had stopped laughing. My guess was that he was going to let us see some power objects he had in his pouch. For an instant I thought the young men were going to cluster around him, for they made a sudden movement in unison. All of them bent forward a little bit, as if they were going to stand up, but then they all tucked their left legs in and went back to that mysterious position that was so hard on my knees. I tucked my left leg in as casually as possible. I found that if I did not sit on my left foot, that is, if I kept a half-kneeling position, my knees did not hurt as much. Don Juan stood up and walked around the big boulder until he was out of sight. He must have fed the fire before he stood up, while I was tucking in my leg, for the new sticks chirped as they ignited, and long flames spurted out. The effect was extremely dramatic. The flames grew twice as big. Don Juan suddenly stepped out from behind the boulder and stood where he had been sitting. I had a moment of bewilderment. Don Juan had put on a funny black hat. It had peaks on the side, by the ears, and it was round on top. It occurred to me that it was actually a pirate's hat. He was wearing a long black coat with tails, fastened with a single shiny metallic button, and he had a peg leg. I laughed to myself. Don Juan really looked silly in his pirate's costume. I began to wonder where he had gotten that outfit out there in the wilderness. I assumed that it must have been hidden behind a rock. I commented to myself that all Don Juan needed was a patch over his eye and a parrot on his shoulder to be the perfect stereotype of a pirate. Don Juan looked at every member of the group, sweeping his eyes slowly from right to left. Then he looked up above us and stared into the darkness behind us. He remained in that position for a moment, and then he went around the boulder and disappeared. I did not notice how he walked. Obviously, he must have had his knee bent in order to depict a man with a wooden leg. When he turned around to walk behind a boulder, I should have seen his bent leg, but I was so mystified by his acts that I did not pay any attention to details. The flames lost their strength at the very moment Don Juan went around the boulder. I thought that his timing had been superb. He must have calculated how long it would take for the sticks he had added to the fire to burn, and had arranged his appearance and exit according to that calculation. The change in the intensity of the fire was very dramatic for the group. There was a ripple of nervousness among the young men. As the flames diminished in size, the young men went back in unison to a cross-legged sitting position. I expected Don Juan to step out from behind the boulder right away and sit down again, but he did not. He remained out of sight. I waited impatiently. The young men were sitting with an impassive look on their faces. I could not understand what Don Juan had intended with all those histrionics. After a long wait, I turned to the young man on my right and asked him in a low voice if any of the items Don Juan had put on, the funny hat and the long tail coat, and the fact he was standing on a peg leg, had any meaning to him. The young man looked at me with a funny blank expression. He seemed confused. I repeated my question, and the other young man next to him looked at me attentively in order to listen. They looked at each other seemingly in utter confusion. I said that to me the hat and the stump and the coat made him into a pirate. By then all four young men had come closer together around me. They giggled softly and fretted nervously. They seemed to be at a loss for words. The most daring of them finally spoke to me. He said that Don Juan did not have a hat on, was not wearing a long coat, and was certainly not standing on a stump, but that he had a black collar shawl over his head and a jet black tunic, like a friar's, that went all the way to the ground. No. Another young man exclaimed softly. He didn't have a cowl. That's right, the others said. The young man who had spoken first looked at me with an expression of total disbelief. I told them that we had to review what had happened very carefully and very quietly, and that I was sure Don Juan had wanted us to do so, and thus he had left us alone. The young man who was to my extreme right said that Don Juan was in rags. He had on a tattered poncho, or some sort of Indian coat, and a most beat-up sombrero. He was holding a basket with things in it, but he was not sure what those things were. He added that Don Juan was not really dressed as a beggar, but rather as a man who was coming back from an interminable journey loaded with strange things. The young man who had seen Don Juan with a black cowl said that he had nothing in his hands, but that his hair was long and wild, as if he were a wild man that had just killed a friar and had put on his clothes, but could not hide his wildness. The young man to my left chuckled softly and commented on the weirdness of it all. He said that Don Juan was dressed as an important man who had just gotten off his horse. He had leather leggings for horseback riding, big spurs, a whip that he kept beating on his left palm, a Chihuahua hat with a conical crown, and two .45 caliber automatic pistols. He said that Don Juan was the picture of a well-to-do ranchero. The young man to my extreme left laughed shyly and did not volunteer to reveal what he had seen. I coaxed him, but the others did not seem to be interested. He appeared to be rather too shy to talk. The fire was about to be extinguished when Don Juan came out from behind the boulder. "We'd better leave the young men to their doings," he said to me. "Bid them goodbye." He did not look at them. He began to walk away slowly to give me time to say goodbye. The young men embraced me. There were no flames in the fire, but the live coals reflected enough glare. Don Juan was like a dark shadow a few feet away, and the young men were a circle of neatly defined static silhouettes. They were like a row of jet black statues set in a background of darkness. It was at that point that the total event had an impact on me. A chill ran up my spine. I caught up with Don Juan. He told me in a tone of great urgency not to turn around to look at the young men, because at that moment they were a circle of shadows. My stomach felt a force coming from the outside. It was as if a hand had grabbed me. I screamed involuntarily. Don Juan whispered that there was so much power in that area that it would be very easy for me to use the gate of power. We jogged for hours. I fell down 5 times. Don Juan counted out loud every time I lost my balance. Then he came to a halt. "Sit down, huddle against the rocks, and cover your belly with your hands," he whispered in my ear. Sunday, April 1962. As soon as there was enough light in the morning we started walking. Don Juan guided me to the place where I had left my car. I was hungry, but I felt otherwise invigorated and well rested. We ate some crackers and drank some bottled mineral water that I had in my car. I wanted to ask him some questions that were overwhelming me, but he put his finger to his lips. By mid-afternoon we were in the border town where he wanted me to leave him. We went to a restaurant to eat lunch. The place was empty. We sat at a table by a window looking out at the busy main street and ordered our food. Don Juan seemed relaxed. His eyes shone with a mischievous glint. I felt encouraged and began a barrage of questions. I mainly wanted to know about his disguise. "I showed you a little bit of my not doing," he said, and his eyes seemed to glow. "But none of us saw the same disguise," I said. "How did you do that?" "It's all very simple," he replied. "They were only disguises, because everything we do is in some way merely a disguise. Everything we do, as I have told you, is a matter of doing. A man of knowledge could hook himself to everyone's doing and come up with weird things. But they are not weird, not really. They are weird only to those who are trapped in doing. Those 4 young men and yourself are not aware yet of not doing, so it was easy to fool all of you. But how did you fool us? It won't make sense to you. There is no way for you to understand it. Try me, Don Juan, please." Let's say that when every one of us is born we bring with us a little ring of power. That little ring is almost immediately put to use. So every one of us is already hooked from birth, and our rings of power are joined to everyone else's. In other words, our rings of power are hooked to the doing of the world in order to make the world. Give me an example so I could understand it, I said. For instance, our rings of power, yours and mine, are hooked right now to the doing in this room. We are making this room. Our rings of power are spinning this room into being at this very moment. Wait, I said. This room is here by itself. I am not creating it. I have nothing to do with it. Don Juan did not seem to be concerned with my argumentative protests. He very calmly maintained that the room we were in was brought to being and was kept in place because of the force of everybody's ring of power. You see, he continued, every one of us knows the doing of rooms because, in one way or another, we have spent much of our lives in rooms. A man of knowledge, on the other hand, develops another ring of power. I would call it the ring of not doing, because it is hooked to not doing. With that ring, therefore, he can spin another world. A young waitress brought our food and seemed to be suspicious of us. Don Juan whispered that I should pay her to show her that I had enough money. I don't blame her for distrusting you, he said and roared with laughter. You look like hell. I paid the woman and tipped her, and when she left us alone I stared at Don Juan, trying to find a way to recapture the thread of our conversation. He came to my rescue. Your difficulty is that you haven't yet developed your extra ring of power, and your body doesn't know not doing, he said. I did not understand what he had said. My mind was locked in quite a prosaic concern. All I wanted to know was whether or not he had put on a pirate's outfit. Don Juan did not answer but laughed uproariously. I begged him to explain. But I've just explained it to you, he retorted. You mean that you didn't put on any disguise? I asked. All I did was to hook my ring of power to your own doing, he said. You yourself did the rest and so did the others. That's incredible, I exclaimed. We all have been taught to agree about doing, he said softly. You don't have any idea of the power that agreement brings with it. But, fortunately, not doing is equally miraculous and powerful. I felt an uncontrollable ripple in my stomach. There was an unbridgeable abysm between my first-hand experience and his explanation. As an ultimate defense I ended up, as I had always done, with a tinge of doubt and distrust and with the question, what if Don Juan was really in cahoots with the young men, and he himself had set it all up? I changed the subject and asked him about the 4 apprentices. Did you tell me that they were shadows? I asked. That's right. Were they allies? No. They were apprentices of a man I know. Why did you call them shadows? Because at that moment they had been touched by the power of not doing, and since they are not as stupid as you are, they shifted into something quite different from what you know. I didn't want you to look at them for that reason. It would have only injured you. I did not have any more questions. I was not hungry either. Don Juan ate heartily and seemed to be in an excellent mood. But I felt dejected. Suddenly a consuming fatigue possessed me. I realized that Don Juan's path was too arduous for me. I commented that I did not have the qualifications to become a sorcerer. Perhaps another meeting with Mescalito will help you, he said. I assured him that that was the farthest thing from my mind, and that I would not even consider the possibility. Very drastic things have to happen to you in order for you to allow your body to profit from all you have learned, he said. I ventured the opinion that since I was not an Indian, I was not really qualified to live the unusual life of a sorcerer. Perhaps if I could disentangle myself from all my commitments I could fare in your world a little better, I said. Or if I would go into the wilderness with you and live there. As it is now, the fact I have a foot in both worlds makes me useless in either. He stared at me for a long moment. This is your world, he said, pointing to the busy street outside the window. You are a man of that world. And out there, in that world, is your hunting ground. There is no way to escape the doing of our world, so what a warrior does is to turn his world into his hunting ground. As a hunter, a warrior knows that the world is made to be used. So he uses every bit of it. A warrior is like a pirate that has no qualms in taking and using anything he wants, except that the warrior doesn't mind or he doesn't feel insulted when he is used and taken himself. A worthy opponent. Tuesday, December 11, 1962. My traps were perfect, the setting was correct. I saw rabbits, squirrels and other rodents, quail, and birds, but I could not catch anything at all during the whole day. Don Juan had told me, as we left his house in the early morning, that I had to wait that day for a gift of power, an exceptional animal that might be lured into my traps, and whose flesh I could dry for power food. Don Juan seemed to be in a pensive mood. He did not make a single suggestion or comment. Near the end of the day he finally made a statement. Someone is interfering with your hunting, he said. Who? I asked, truly surprised. He looked at me and smiled and shook his head in a gesture of disbelief. You act as if you didn't know who, he said. And you've known who all day. I was going to protest, but I saw no point in it. I knew he was going to say La Catalina, and if that was the kind of knowledge he was talking about, then he was right, I did know who. We either go home now, he continued, or we wait until dark and use the twilight to catch her. He appeared to be waiting for my decision. I wanted to leave. I began to gather some thin rope that I was using, but before I could voice my wish he stopped me with a direct command. Sit down, he said. It would be a simpler and more sober decision to just leave now, but this is a peculiar case, and I think we must stay. This show is just for you. What do you mean? Someone is interfering with you, in particular, so that makes it your show. I know who and you also know who. You scare me, I said. Not me, he replied, laughing. That woman, who is out there prowling, is scaring you. He paused as if he were waiting for the effect of his words to show on me. I had to admit that I was terrified. Over a month before, I had had a horrendous confrontation with a sorceress called La Catalina. I had faced her at the risk of my life because Don Juan had convinced me that she was after his life and that he was incapable of fending off her onslaughts. After I had come in contact with her, Don Juan disclosed to me that she had never really been of any danger to him, and that the whole affair had been a trick, not in the sense of a malicious prank, but in the sense of a trap to ensnare me. His method was so unethical to me that I became furious with him. Upon hearing my angry outburst, Don Juan had begun to sing some Mexican tunes. He imitated popular crooners, and his renditions were so comical that I had ended up laughing like a child. He entertained me for hours. I never knew he had such a repertoire of idiotic songs. "Let me tell you something," he had finally said on that occasion. "If we wouldn't be tricked, we would never learn. The same thing happened to me, and it'll happen to anyone. The art of a benefactor is to take us to the brink. A benefactor can only point the way and trick. I tricked you before. You remember the way I recaptured your hunter's spirit, don't you? You yourself told me that hunting made you forget about plants. You were willing to do a lot of things in order to be a hunter, things you wouldn't have done in order to learn about plants. Now you must do a lot more in order to survive." He stared at me and broke into a fit of laughter. "This is all crazy," I said. "We are rational beings." "You're rational," he retorted. "I am not." "Of course you are," I insisted. "You are one of the most rational men I have ever met." "All right," he exclaimed. "Let us not argue. I am rational, so what?" I involved him in the argument of why it was necessary for two rational beings to proceed in such an insane way, as we had proceeded with the Lady Witch. "You're rational, all right," he said fiercely. "And that means you believe that you know a lot about the world, but do you? Do you really? You have only seen the acts of people. Your experiences are limited only to what people have done to you or to others. You know nothing about this mysterious unknown world." He signaled me to follow him to my car, and we drove to the small Mexican town nearby. I did not ask what we were going to do. He made me park my car by a restaurant, and then we walked around the bus depot and the general store. Don Juan walked on my right side, leading me. Suddenly I became aware that someone else was walking side by side with me to my left, but before I had time to turn to look, Don Juan made a fast and sudden movement. He leaned forward, as if he were picking something from the ground, and then grabbed me by the armpit when I nearly stumbled over him. He dragged me to my car and did not let go of my arm, even to allow me to unlock the door. I fumbled with the keys for a moment. He shoved me gently into the car and then got in himself. "Drive slowly and stop in front of the store," he said. When I had stopped, Don Juan signaled me with a nod of his head to look. La Catalina was standing at the place where Don Juan had grabbed me. I recoiled involuntarily. The woman took a couple of steps towards the car and stood there defiantly. I scrutinized her carefully and concluded that she was a beautiful woman. She was very dark and had a plump body, but she seemed to be strong and muscular. She had a round, full face with high cheekbones and two long braids of jet black hair. What surprised me the most was her youth. She was at the most in her early 30s. "Let her come closer if she wants," Don Juan whispered. She took 3 or 4 steps towards my car and stopped perhaps 10 feet away. We looked at each other. At that moment I felt there was nothing threatening about her. I smiled and waved at her. She giggled as if she were a shy little girl and covered her mouth. Somehow I felt delighted. I turned to Don Juan to comment on her appearance and behavior, and he scared me half to death with a yell. "Don't turn your back to that woman, damn it," he said in a forceful voice. I quickly turned to look at the woman. She had taken another couple of steps towards my car and was standing barely 5 feet away from my door. She was smiling. Her teeth were big and white and very clean. There was something eerie about her smile, however. It was not friendly, it was a contained grin, only her mouth smiled. Her eyes were black and cold and were staring at me fixedly. I experienced a chill all over my body. Don Juan began to laugh in a rhythmical cackle. After a moment's wait, the woman slowly backed away and disappeared among people. We drove away and Don Juan speculated that if I did not tighten up my life and learn, she was going to step on me as one steps on a defenseless bug. "She is the worthy opponent I told you I had found for you," he said. Don Juan said that we had to wait for an omen before we knew what to do with the woman who was interfering with my hunting. "If we see or hear a crow, we'll know for sure that we can wait, and we'll also know where to wait," he added. He slowly turned around in a complete circle, scanning all the surroundings. "This is not the place to wait," he said in a whisper. We began to walk towards the east. It was already fairly dark. Suddenly 2 crows flew out from behind some tall bushes and disappeared behind a hill. Don Juan said that the hill was our destination. Once we arrived there, he circled it and chose a place facing the southeast at the bottom of the hill. He cleaned the dry twigs and leaves and other debris from a circular spot 5 or 6 feet in diameter. I attempted to help him, but he refused me with a strong movement of his hand. He put his finger over his lips and made a gesture of silence. When he had finished, he pulled me to the center of the circle, made me face the south away from the hill, and whispered in my ear that I had to imitate his movements. He began a sort of dance, making a rhythmical thump with his right foot. It consisted of 7 even beats spaced by a cluster of 3 fast thumps. I tried to adapt myself to his rhythm, and after a few clumsy attempts, I was more or less capable of reproducing the same thumping. "What's this for?" I whispered in his ear. He told me, also in a whisper, that I was thumping like a rabbit, and that sooner or later the prowler would be attracted by the noise and would show up to see what was going on. Once I had copied the rhythm, Don Juan ceased to thump himself, but had me continue, marking the pace with a movement of his hand. From time to time he would listen attentively, with his head slightly tilted to the right, seemingly to pick out noises in the chaparral. At one point he signaled me to stop, and he remained in a most alert position. It was as if he were ready to spring up and jump on an unknown and unseen assailant. Then he motioned me to continue the thumping, and after a while he stopped me again. Every time I stopped, he listened with such a concentration that every fiber in his body seemed to be tense to the point of bursting. Suddenly he jumped to my side and whispered in my ear that the twilight was at its full power. I looked around. The chaparral was a dark mass, and so were the hills and the rocks. The sky was dark blue and I could not see the clouds anymore. The whole world seemed to be a uniform mass of dark silhouettes, which did not have any visible boundaries. I heard the eerie distant cry of an animal, a coyote or perhaps a night bird. It happened so suddenly that I did not pay attention to it. But Don Juan's body jerked a bit. I felt its vibration as he stood next to me. "Here we go," he whispered. "Thump again and be ready. She's here." I began to thump furiously and Don Juan put his foot over mine and signaled me frantically to relax and thump rhythmically. "Don't scare her away," he whispered in my ear. "Calm down and don't lose your marbles." He again began to mark the pace of my thumping, and after the second time he made me stop, I heard the same cry again. This time it seemed to be the cry of a bird which was flying over the hill. Don Juan made me thump once more, And just when I stopped, I heard a peculiar rustling sound to my left. It was the sound a heavy animal would make while moving about in the dry underbrush. The thought of a bear crossed my mind, but then I realized that there were no bears in the desert. I grabbed onto Don Juan's arm, and he smiled at me and put his finger to his mouth in a gesture of silence. I stared into the darkness towards my left, but he signaled me not to. He repeatedly pointed directly above me, and then he made me turn around slowly and silently until I was facing the dark mass of the hill. Don Juan kept his finger leveled at a certain point on the hill. I kept my eyes glued to that spot, and suddenly, as if in a nightmare, a dark shadow leaped at me. I shrieked and fell down to the ground on my back. For a moment the dark silhouette was superimposed against a dark blue sky, and then it sailed through the air and landed beyond us, in the bushes. I heard the sound of a heavy body crashing into the shrubs, and then an eerie outcry. Don Juan helped me up and guided me in the darkness to the place where I had left my traps. He made me gather and disassemble them, and then he scattered the pieces away in all directions. He performed all this without saying a single word. We did not speak at all on our way back to his house. "What do you want me to say?" Don Juan asked after I had urged him repeatedly to explain the events I had witnessed a few hours before. "What was it?" I asked. "You know damn well who it was," he said. "Don't water it down with what was it. It is who it was that is important." I had worked out an explanation that seemed to suit me. The figure I had seen looked very much like a kite that someone had let out over the hill, while someone else, behind us, had pulled it to the ground, thus the effect of a dark silhouette sailing through the air perhaps 15 or 20 yards. He listened attentively to my explanation and then laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. "Quit beating around the bush," he said. "Get to the point. Wasn't it a woman?" I had to admit that when I fell down and looked up, I saw the dark silhouette of a woman with a long skirt leaping over me in a very slow motion. Then something seemed to have pulled the dark silhouette, and it flew over me with great speed and crashed into the bushes. In fact, that movement was what had given me the idea of a kite. Don Juan refused to discuss the incident any further. The next day he left to fulfill some mysterious errand, and I went to visit some Yaqui friends in another community. Wednesday, December 12, 1962. As soon as I arrived at the Yaqui community, the Mexican storekeeper told me that he had rented a record player and 20 records from an outfit in Ciudad Obregón for the fiesta he was planning to give that night in honor of the Virgin of Guadalupe. He had already told everybody that he had made all the necessary arrangements through Julio, the traveling salesman who came to the Yaqui settlement twice a month to collect installments on a layaway plan for cheap articles of clothing which he had succeeded in selling to some Yaqui Indians. Julio brought the record player early in the afternoon and hooked it to the dynamo that provided electricity for the store. He made sure that it worked, then he turned up the volume to its maximum, reminded the storekeeper not to touch 9 knobs, and began to sort the 20 records. "I know how many scratches each of them has," Julio said to the storekeeper. "Tell that to my daughter," the storekeeper replied. "You're responsible, not your daughter. Just the same, she's the one who'll be changing the records." Julio insisted that it did not make any difference to him whether she or someone else was going to actually handle the record player, as long as the storekeeper paid for any records that were damaged. The storekeeper began to argue with Julio. Julio's face became red. He turned from time to time to the large group of Yaqui Indians congregated in front of the Moor and made signs of despair or frustration by moving his hands or contorting his face in a grimace. Seemingly as a final resort, he demanded a cash deposit. That precipitated another long argument about what constituted a damaged record. Julio murmured with authority that any broken record had to be paid for in full, as if it were new. The storekeeper became angrier and began to pull out his extension cords. He seemed bent upon unhooking the record player and canceling the party. He made it clear to his clients congregated in front of the Moor that he had tried his best to come to terms with Julio. For a moment it seemed that the party was going to fail before it had started. Lilas, the old Yaqui Indian in whose house I was staying, made some derogatory comments in a loud voice about the Yaquis' sad state of affairs, that they could not even celebrate their most revered religious festivity, the Day of the Virgin of Guadalupe. I wanted to intervene and offer my help, but Bias stopped me. He said that if I were to make the cash deposit, the storekeeper himself would smash the records. "He's worse than anybody," he said. "Let him pay the deposit. He bleeds us, so why shouldn't he pay?" After a long discussion in which, strangely enough, everyone present was in favor of Julio, the storekeeper hit upon terms which were mutually agreeable. He did not pay a cash deposit, but accepted responsibility for the records and the record player. Julio's motorcycle left a trail of dust as he headed for some of the more remote houses in the locality. Bias said that he was trying to get to his customers before they came to the store and spent all their money buying booze. As he was saying this, a group of Indians emerged from behind the store. Bias looked at them and began to laugh, and so did everyone else there. Bias told me that those Indians were Julio's customers and had been hiding behind the store waiting for him to leave. The party began early. The storekeeper's daughter put a record on the turntable and brought the arm down. There was a terrible loud screech and a high-pitched buzz, and then came a blasting sound of a trumpet and some guitars. The party consisted of playing the records at full volume. There were 4 young Mexican men who danced with the storekeeper's 2 daughters and 3 other young Mexican women. The Yaquis did not dance. They watched with apparent delight every movement the dancers made. They seemed to be enjoying themselves just watching and gulping down cheap tequila. I bought individual drinks for everybody I knew. I wanted to avoid any feelings of resentment. I circulated among the numerous Indians and talked to them and then offered them drinks. My pattern of behavior worked until they realized I was not drinking at all. That seemed to annoy everyone at once. It was as if collectively they had discovered that I did not belong there. The Indians became very gruff and gave me sly looks. The Mexicans, who were as drunk as the Indians, also realized at the same time that I had not danced, and that appeared to offend them even more. They became very aggressive. One of them forcibly took me by the arm and dragged me closer to the record player. Another served me a full cup of tequila and wanted me to drink it all in one gulp and prove that I was a macho. I tried to stall them and laughed idiotically as if I were actually enjoying the situation. I said that I would like to dance first and then drink. One of the young men called out the name of a song. The girl in charge of the record player began to search in the pile of records. She seemed to be a little tipsy, although none of the women had openly been drinking and had trouble fitting a record on the turntable. A young man said that the record she had selected was not a twist. She fumbled with the pile, trying to find the suitable one, and everybody closed in around her and left me. That gave me time to run behind the store, away from the lighted area, and out of sight. I stood about 30 yards away in the darkness of some bushes trying to decide what to do. I was tired. I felt it was time to get in my car and go back home. I began to walk to Bias's house, where my car was parked. I figured that if I drove slowly, no one would notice that I was leaving. The people in charge of the record player were apparently still looking for the record. All I could hear was the high-pitched buzzing of the loudspeaker, but then came the blasting sound of a twist. I laughed out loud, thinking that they had probably turned to where I had been and found out that I had disappeared. I saw some dark silhouettes of people walking in the opposite direction, going towards the store. We passed each other and they mumbled, "Buenas noches." I recognized them and spoke to them. I told them that it was a great party. Before I came to a sharp bend in the road, I encountered two other people, whom I did not recognize, but I greeted them anyway. The blasting sound of the record player was almost as loud there on the road as it was in front of the store. It was a dark, starless night, but the glare from the store lights allowed me to have a fairly good visual perception of my surroundings. Bias's house was very near, and I accelerated my pace. I noticed then the dark shape of a person, sitting or perhaps squatting to my left, at the bend of the road. I thought for an instant that it might have been one of the people from the party who had left before I had. The person seemed to be defecating on the side of the road. That seemed odd. People in the community went into the thick bushes to perform their bodily functions. I thought that whoever it was in front of me must have been drunk. I came to the bend and said, "Buenas noches." The person answered me with an eerie, gruff, inhuman howl. The hair on my body literally stood on end. For a second I was paralyzed. Then I began to walk fast. I took a quick glance. I saw that the dark silhouette had stood up halfway. It was a woman. She was stooped over, leaning forward. She walked in that position for a few yards, and then she hopped. I began to run, while the woman hopped like a bird by my side, keeping up with my speed. By the time I arrived at Bias's house, she was cutting in front of me, and we had almost touched. I leaped across a small dry ditch in front of the house and crashed through the flimsy door. Bias was already in the house and seemed unconcerned with my story. "They pulled a good one on you," he said reassuringly. "The Indians take delight in teasing foreigners." My experience had been so unnerving that the next day I drove to Don Juan's house instead of going home as I had planned to do. Don Juan returned in the late afternoon. I did not give him time to say anything but blurted out the whole story, including Bias's commentary. Don Juan's face became somber. Perhaps it was only my imagination, but I thought he was worried. "Don't put so much stock in what Bias told you," he said in a serious tone. "He knows nothing of the struggles between sorcerers. You should have known that it was something serious the moment you noticed that the shadow was to your left. You shouldn't have run either. What was I supposed to do? Stand there? Right? When a warrior encounters his opponent and the opponent is not an ordinary human being, he must make his stand. That is the only thing that makes him invulnerable. What are you saying, Don Juan?" I'm saying that you have had your third encounter with your worthy opponent. She's following you around, waiting for a moment of weakness on your part. She almost bagged you this time." I felt a surge of anxiety and accused him of putting me in unnecessary danger. I complained that the game he was playing with me was cruel. "It would be cruel if this would have happened to an average man," he said. "But the instant one begins to live like a warrior, one is no longer ordinary. Besides, I didn't find you a worthy opponent because I want to play with you, or tease you, or annoy you. A worthy opponent might spur you on. Under the influence of an opponent like La Catalina, you may have to make use of everything I have taught you. You don't have any other alternative." We were quiet for a while. His words had aroused a tremendous apprehension in me. He then wanted me to imitate as close as possible the cry I had heard after I had said, "Buenas noches." I attempted to reproduce the sound and came up with some weird howling that scared me. Don Juan must have found my rendition funny. He laughed almost uncontrollably. Afterwards he asked me to reconstruct the total sequence, the distance I ran, the distance the woman was from me at the time I encountered her, the distance she was from me at the time I reached the house, and the place where she had begun hopping. "No fat Indian woman could hop that way," he said after assessing all those variables. "They could not even run that far." He made me hop. I could not cover more than 4 feet each time, and if I were correct in my perception, the woman had hopped at least 10 feet with each leap. "Of course, you know that from now on you must be on the lookout," he said in a tone of great urgency. "She will try to tap you on your left shoulder during a moment when you are unaware and weak." "What should I do?" I asked. "It is meaningless to complain," he said. "What's important from this point on is the strategy of your life." I could not concentrate at all on what he was saying. I took notes automatically. After a long silence he asked if I had any pain behind my ears or in the nape of my neck. I said no, and he told me that if I had experienced an uncomfortable sensation in either of those two areas, it would have meant that I had been clumsy and that La Catalina had injured me. "Everything you did that night was clumsy," he said. "First of all, you went to the party to kill time, as though there is any time to kill. That weakened you." "You mean I shouldn't go to parties?" "No, I don't mean that. You may go any place you wish, but if you do, you must assume the full responsibility for that act. A warrior lives his life strategically. He would attend a party or a reunion like that only if his strategy calls for it. That means, of course, that he would be in total control and would perform all the acts that he deems necessary." He looked at me fixedly and smiled, then covered his face and chuckled softly. "You are in a terrible bind," he said. "Your opponent is on your trail and for the first time in your life you cannot afford to act helter-skelter. This time you will have to learn a totally different doing, the doing of strategy. Think of it this way. If you survive the onslaughts of La Catalina, you will have to thank her someday for having forced you to change your doing." "What a terrible way of putting it!" I exclaimed. "What if I don't survive?" "A warrior never indulges in thoughts like that," he said. "When he has to act with his fellow men, a warrior follows the doing of strategy, and in that doing there are no victories or defeats. In that doing there are only actions." I asked him what the doing of strategy entailed. "It entails that one is not at the mercy of people," he replied. "At that party, for instance, you were a clown, Not because it served your purposes to be a clown, but because you placed yourself at the mercy of those people. You never had any control, and thus you had to run away from them. What should I have done? Not go there at all, or else go there to perform a specific act. After horsing around with the Mexicans you were weak, and La Catalina used that opportunity. So she placed herself in the road to wait for you. Your body knew that something was out of place, though, and yet you spoke to her. That was terrible. You must not utter a single word to your opponent during one of those encounters. Then you turned your back to her. That was even worse. Then you ran away from her, and that was the worst thing you could have done. Apparently she is clumsy. A sorcerer that is worth his salt would have mowed you down right then, the instant you turned your back and ran away. So far your only defense is to stay put and do your dance. What dance are you talking about? I asked. He said that the rabbit thumping he had taught me was the first movement of the dance that a warrior groomed and enlarged throughout his life, and then executed in his last stand on earth. I had a moment of strange sobriety, and a series of thoughts occurred to me. On one level it was clear that what had taken place between me and La Catalina, the first time I had confronted her, was real. La Catalina was real, and I could not discard the possibility that she was actually following me. On the other level I could not understand how she was following me, and this gave rise to the faint suspicion that Don Juan might be tricking me, and that he himself was somehow producing the weird effects I had witnessed. Don Juan suddenly looked at the sky and told me that there was still time to go and check the sorceress. He reassured me that we were running very little danger, because we were only going to drive by her house. You must confirm her shape, Don Juan said. Then there won't be any doubts left in your mind, one way or the other. My hands began to sweat profusely, and I had to dry them repeatedly with a towel. We got in my car and Don Juan directed me to the main highway, and then to a white unpaved road. I drove in the center of it. Heavy trucks and tractors had carved deep trenches, and my car was too low to go on either the left or the right side of the road. We went slowly amid a thick cloud of dust. The coarse gravel which was used to level the road had lumped with dirt during the rains, and chunks of dry mud rocks bounced against the metal underside of my car, making loud explosive sounds. Don Juan told me to slow down as we were coming to a small bridge. There were 4 Indians sitting there and they waved at us. I was not sure whether or not I knew them. We passed the bridge and the road curved gently. That's the woman's house, Don Juan whispered to me as he pointed with his eyes to a white house with a high bamboo fence all around it. He told me to make a U-turn and stop in the middle of the road, and wait to see if the woman became suspicious enough to show her face. We stayed there perhaps 10 minutes. I thought it was an interminable time. Don Juan did not say a word. He sat motionless, looking at the house. There she is, he said, and his body gave a sudden jump. I saw the dark, foreboding silhouette of a woman standing inside the house, looking through the open door. The room was dark, and that only accentuated the darkness of the woman's silhouette. After a few minutes the woman stepped out of the darkness of the room and stood in the doorway and watched us. We looked at her for a moment, and then Don Juan told me to drive on. I was speechless. I could have sworn that she was the woman I had seen hopping by the road in the darkness. About half an hour later, when we had turned onto the paved highway, Don Juan spoke to me. "What do you say?" he asked. Did you recognize the shape? I hesitated for a long time before answering. I was afraid of the commitment entailed in saying yes. I carefully worded my reply and said that I thought it had been too dark to be completely sure. He laughed and tapped me gently on my head. She was the one, wasn't she? He asked. He did not give me time to reply. He put a finger to his mouth in a gesture of silence and whispered in my ear that it was meaningless to say anything, and that in order to survive La Catalina's onslaughts, I had to make use of everything he had taught me. And that's not all. Our experts and regular viewers respond to all comments. Also check if you forgot to subscribe and set your bell to receive notifications about new audiobooks and other useful self-development materials that we release regularly. Join in the discussions, don't forget to give likes and, if possible and inspired, support the development of the channel financially. All useful links will be in the description and the first attached comment. Goodness, love and wisdom to all. And now move on to watch the next part of the video at the links below, or choose something from the playlists of the channel and those you see on the screen.